Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about the Crusades, 2 centuries of war for the Holy Land. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The light is failing over the hills of Judea, and the stones are turning gold. Not the gold of wealth or ornament, but the particular gold of this place and this hour, warm and ancient and a little sorrowful. The way late sunlight always is when it falls on things that have been standing for a very long time. The limestone that builds these hills is called mizzi, and it has the property of absorbing light during the day and releasing it in the evening, so that at dusk the city that crowns this ridge seems to glow from inside, as though something beneath the stone has been quietly burning for centuries and is only now, in the last hour of the day, letting a little of that heat escape. The air smells of dust and time and the faint sweetness of cedar resin. Somewhere below the ridge, a muezzin is calling the evening prayer, his voice rising in long, searching arcs over the rooftops before dissolving into the dimming sky. The first stars are not yet visible, but the sky is that color between blue and violet that tells you they are coming. The city is very old. It has been prayed in and wept over and built and broken and rebuilt so many times that its stones seem to carry the weight of all of it. Quietly, without complaint. Tonight we walk slowly through one of the most profound and consequential chapters in the long history of that city and the world around it. The 2 centuries of the Crusades, which began in the final years of the 11th century and continued in waves and pauses and renewals until the end of the 13th. It was an era in which the great faiths of the medieval world, Christianity and Islam, with Judaism woven through both histories in ways both painful and illuminating, converged on this narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the desert, each believing with total sincerity that it had a claim here that transcended ordinary politics, that the divine itself had a stake in what happened on these hills. Tonight we will let that world settle around us slowly, its cities and its deserts, its kings and its pilgrims, its moments of unexpected kindness and its long shadows. Let the golden light of this ancient place hold you. We are in no hurry. To understand the Crusades, you must first feel the pull of the land they were fought over. Jerusalem al-Quds in Arabic, meaning the holy. The sacred sits on a ridge in the Judean hills at roughly 2,500 feet above sea level, high enough that in winter it receives snow, and in every season it commands views over a landscape of extraordinary beauty and harshness both. To the west, The hills descend gradually toward the Mediterranean coast, through valleys of olive and almond trees, past ancient terrace slopes where human beings have grown things for 10,000 years. To the east, the land drops precipitously. Within 20 miles you descend from this high, cool ridge all the way to the Dead Sea, the lowest point on the surface of the earth. The air thickening and warming with every foot of descent until the coolness of the ridge feels like a memory from another world. The Jordan River runs through that sunken valley, its waters slow and brown and warm, and beyond it the brown hills of the Transjordan rise into the blue distance. This geography, the feeling of a place lifted above the ordinary world, surrounded by wilderness, set apart, contributes something real and irreducible to the sanctity that three faiths have found here. There is a quality of the light, a quality of the silence, a quality of standing on stone that other human beings have been standing on since the city was young, that reaches past the rational mind and touches something older. Within the city, at its elevated heart, sits the Temple Mount, Al-Haram al-Sharif in Arabic, meaning the noble sanctuary, a great raised platform of ancient stone that is, without question, one of the most sacred squares of ground on earth. For Jews, this is the site of the first and second temples, the Temple of Solomon, destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 before the Common Era, and the Temple of Herod, destroyed by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era, and the Western Wall, the surviving retaining wall of the temple platform, is the holiest accessible site in Judaism, the place toward which Jewish prayer has been directed from every synagogue in the world for nearly 2,000 years. For Muslims, the Mount is the site of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, the miraculous nocturnal voyage described in the Quran in which he was carried from Mecca to Jerusalem and from there ascended through the heavens, and the Dome of the Rock, built over the sacred stone from which the ascent is said to have begun, is one of the oldest and most beautiful buildings in the world. Its golden dome visible from miles away, its interior covered in mosaics and inscriptions of extraordinary refinement. For Christians, the city is the place of the crucifixion and the resurrection, the city where the narrative that defines the faith reached its crisis and its resolution, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the traditional sites of both Golgotha and the empty tomb, is the destination toward which Christian pilgrimage has been oriented since the earliest centuries. Three faiths, one small high plateau, and an overlay of sacred meaning so dense and so mutually implicating that the ground itself seems to carry a charge. a significance that no political arrangement has ever managed to fully contain or resolve. By the time Pope Urban II stood in a field at Clermont in France in November of 1095 and called the Knights of Christendom to take up arms and journey to the Holy Land, Jerusalem had been under Muslim rule for more than 4 centuries. It had been taken from the Byzantine Empire in the year 638 by the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, who had entered the city peacefully, had in fact insisted on receiving its keys himself, riding in on a camel rather than a war horse, wearing a simple robe rather than ceremonial robes, and had issued a decree guaranteeing the safety of the city's Christians and Jews. For most of the 4 centuries that followed, Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem continued largely unimpeded. Pilgrims from Europe, an enormous number of them, traveling in the slow, dangerous, often fatal way that medieval pilgrimage demanded, on foot and on mule across the Alps and through the Balkans and across Anatolia and through the deserts of Syria, arrived at Jerusalem's gates and were permitted to enter and pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site believed to encompass both the hill of the crucifixion and the tomb of the resurrection. Muslim rulers charged fees, sometimes burdensome ones, and there were periods of difficulty and occasional persecution. But for most of this long period, the city functioned as a shared sacred space, improbably but genuinely. What had changed by the time of Urban's call at Clermont was the political landscape of the Muslim world. The Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people from the Central Asian steppes who had converted to Islam and then swept westward with extraordinary military energy, had in the second half of the 11th century conquered most of Anatolia, defeating the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 in a catastrophe from which the Eastern Roman Empire never fully recovered. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I sent an urgent appeal to Rome asking for military assistance to recover his lost territories. And Urban saw in that appeal something larger than a diplomatic request from a schismatic emperor. He saw an opportunity to unite the fractious nobility of Western Europe under a sacred banner, to redirect the endemic violence of feudal society outward, and to offer the knights and peasants of Christendom something that resonated deeply in the medieval imagination: the chance to free the city of Christ from those who, in the European understanding of the moment, had no right to hold it. The speech at Clermont, by all accounts, produced an extraordinary response. The crowd shouted Deus vult, God wills it, and men began immediately to take the cross, sewing cloth crosses onto their tunics as visible signs of their vow. The response that followed was unlike anything Europe had seen before. Thousands took the cross, not just knights and lords, but ordinary people, farmers and tradespeople and the desperately poor, who understood the vow of crusade as both a spiritual adventure and an escape from the grinding limitations of their lives. The First Crusade, which set out in 1096, was actually two movements, one behind the other. The first, a large, poorly organized, largely unarmed mass of people following a charismatic preacher known as Peter the Hermit, never reached the Holy Land. They swept through the Rhine Valley as they traveled east, and in a darkness that must be named honestly, some among them attacked and massacred Jewish communities in the cities along their route, communities that had lived in the Rhineland for generations, that were entirely uninvolved in whatever argument existed between Christendom and the Seljuk rulers of Jerusalem. This was not something ordered by Urban or sanctioned by the Church's formal position. It was the violence of a mob inflamed by religious passion finding a target close at hand. But it happened, and it happened again in later crusades, and it stands as one of the clearest and most painful lessons the Crusades have to teach about the uses and misuses of sacred zeal. The people murdered in the Rhine Valley were as holy as anyone in Jerusalem. They had simply been standing in the way. The military crusade that followed, the organized force of knights and lords that crossed the Bosphorus in the autumn of 1096 and wound its way through Anatolia towards Syria and Palestine, was a different kind of thing, though not an uncomplicated one. It was a fighting force of perhaps 70,000 people at its peak, including non-combatants, and it traveled under conditions of extreme hardship through landscapes utterly unlike anything most of its members had known. The Anatolian plateau in summer is scorching and waterless. The armies moved slowly, harassed by Seljuk mounted archers who attacked from a distance and vanished, denying the heavy European cavalry the kind of pitched battle they had been trained for. Soldiers and horses died of thirst and heat and hunger in alarming numbers. The siege of Antioch, the great city that had once been one of the most important in the Roman world, lasted through the winter of 1097 to 1098, a period of extraordinary suffering on both sides, the Crusaders slowly starving outside the walls while the garrison inside faced its own diminishing supplies. And yet the Crusaders took Antioch. And then, after further months of struggle and heat and disease, they came at last to the ridge above Jerusalem and saw the city below them, glowing in the summer sun, and wept. Let that moment hold for a little while. Imagine it, or let it exist somewhere in the space of this evening without needing to imagine it too precisely. Men who had walked for 3 years through Anatolia and Syria and Palestine, who had buried friends and brothers along every road, who had doubted and despaired and recommitted themselves to a vow that must have seemed, in the worst moments of the long march, like a promise made to a God who was not listening. And then the city, on its ridge, in the light, whatever one thinks of the politics and the violence and the ideology of the Crusades, and there is much to think carefully about, that moment of arrival, that convergence of exhausted humanity and ancient stone, and the overwhelming reality of a place they had been told since childhood was the center of the world, belongs to the complicated record of what human beings are capable of feeling. The Crusaders besieged Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. The city was held by the Fatimid rulers of Egypt, who had taken it from the Seljuks only the previous year. The siege lasted 5 weeks, culminating on the 15th of July with a breach in the walls, and what followed was a catastrophe whose scale and horror have never been adequately explained away or argued out of the historical record. The massacre of Jerusalem's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants was extensive. Medieval sources, both Christian and Muslim, describe it in terms that make clear it was understood even at the time as extraordinary in its violence. A city's worth of people, whose only connection to the long political argument over the Holy Land was that they happened to live there, killed in the streets and the mosques and in the Temple Mount precincts. The Jewish community, who had taken refuge in their synagogue, were killed there. The Muslim dead filled the streets. The Crusaders wrote home that the blood ran in the streets, and they meant it as an image of divine justice accomplished. That it was also simply blood, the blood of people who had been alive that morning, who had children and occupations and prayers of their own, is a truth that the medieval mind often struggled to hold alongside its theology. As in fact all minds in all eras struggle to hold the full humanity of those their causes have decided to see as abstractions. The Crusaders besieged Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. The city was held by the Fatimid rulers of Egypt, who had taken it from the Seljuks only the previous year. The siege lasted 5 weeks, culminating on the 15th of July with a breach in the walls, and what followed was a catastrophe whose scale and horror have never been adequately explained away or argued out of the historical record. The massacre of Jerusalem's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants was extensive. Medieval sources, both Christian and Muslim, describe it in terms that make clear it was understood even at the time as extraordinary in its violence. A city's worth of people, whose only connection to the long political argument over the Holy Land was that they happened to live there, killed in the streets and the mosques and in the Temple Mount precincts. The Jewish community, who had taken refuge in their synagogue, were killed there. The Muslim dead filled the streets. The Crusaders wrote home that the blood ran in the streets, and they meant it as an image of divine justice accomplished. That it was also simply blood, the blood of people who had been alive that morning, who had children and occupations and prayers of their own, is a truth that the medieval mind often struggled to hold alongside its theology. As in fact all minds in all eras struggle to hold the full humanity of those their causes have decided to see as abstractions. There is a long tradition in writing about the Crusades of asking what they mean, what lesson they carry, what they say about religion and violence and the human capacity for both devotion and destruction. The answer, if there is one, is probably not a simple one. The Crusades were not only about religion, and they were not only about politics, and they were not only about the hunger for land or wealth or adventure, though they were about all of those things simultaneously in ways that resist separation. They were about the way sacred meaning becomes attached to specific places, the way a city, a stone, a well, a hillside, can accumulate centuries of prayer and story until it becomes something that people will walk 3,000 miles through summer heat and mountain snow to touch. They were about the way political institutions, papacy, kingship, the military orders, can harness that attachment and channel it toward purposes that serve institutional interests while genuinely also serving the sincere faith of the individuals who participate. And they were about the way human beings on opposite sides of a great cultural and religious divide can recognize each other and fail to recognize each other, often in the same moment and the same conversation. All of this happened here, on this ridge, under this sky, in a space of 2 centuries. The kingdom of Jerusalem that the Crusaders established in the ruins of that day was, in some ways, a remarkable thing, a medieval European state transplanted into the Eastern Mediterranean, built on the bones of older civilizations, absorbing and adapting and being absorbed in ways its founders probably did not anticipate. The nobility who settled there, the families who became the lords of Jaffa and Tiberias and Nablus and Hebron, who built their castles on hilltops already occupied by Byzantine and Fatimid fortifications, who learned Arabic as a matter of practical necessity and adopted local dress and local diet and local customs, became, over generations, something genuinely new. They were called Polanes by their cousins in Europe, a word meaning roughly the locally born, those who had grown up in the East, and visiting Europeans were often struck by how different they seemed, how much more at ease in the landscape, how fluent in Arab manners and food and dress. The culture that developed in Outremer, a French word meaning the land beyond the sea, which is what Europeans called the Crusader states, was a hybrid thing, a blend of Latin and Greek and Arabic, of Frankish and Byzantine and Levantine, that produced its own architecture and its own art and its own political arrangements. The great castles of the Crusader period still stand in the landscape of Lebanon and Syria and Israel and Jordan, massive things of pale limestone, set on promontories that command views across distances that made their strategic function obvious even now. Their walls thick enough to absorb the blows of any siege engine the medieval world could produce.
Krag des Chevaliers in Syria.
The most celebrated of them sits on a ridge in the mountains between the Syrian interior and the Lebanese coast, and it is so large and so perfectly preserved that standing inside its walls you feel enclosed in a small city rather than a castle, inner courts and outer courts, a great hall and a chapel and granaries and cisterns large enough to supply a garrison through years of siege. The chapel is still there, its Romanesque arches as clean as the day they were cut, looking out into an interior courtyard where sunlight falls in a long rectangle on the stone floor, quiet as prayer. The Crusaders built this, and it is beautiful. And it is the architecture of people who intended to stay, who were not merely camping in an alien land but making a home of it, in stone, in the permanence that stone implies. The ordinary life of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the life lived below the level of sieges and councils of war, in the markets and the vineyards and the fishing villages of the Palestinian coast, was a thing of genuine texture and complexity that the drama of the military campaigns tends to overshadow. The Frankish settlers who stayed, who built houses rather than just camps, who planted gardens and orchards and pressed olive oil and made wine from the grapes of the Carmel and Galilee slopes, were doing what all settlers do everywhere. They were trying to make a home. The towns of the coast, Jaffa, Acre, Tyre, Caesarea, were busy, wealthy, cosmopolitan places in the 12th century. Their harbors handling the trade of 3 continents. Their markets selling everything from Egyptian linen to Syrian glassware to the spices that came up by caravan from the Arabian Peninsula and were transshipped westward to Europe. Venetian and Genoese and Pisan merchants maintained their own enclaves in the port cities, their own churches and warehouses and legal systems, their autonomy guaranteed by treaty. Native Christians, Greek and Syriac and Armenian, communities that had been here long before the Crusaders arrived, lived among the Franks and traded with them and sometimes intermarried with them, navigating the complicated social hierarchy of a society in which being Latin, being of the right ecclesiastical tradition, conferred privileges that older residents of the land did not automatically share. and the pilgrims kept coming. Through all the decades of the Crusader kingdom's existence, the stream of pilgrims from Europe continued, ordinary men and women, not soldiers, who had saved for years or decades for the journey, who traveled in organized groups when possible and alone when necessary, who endured the long sea crossing from the Italian or French or Spanish ports, the weeks at sea that might include storms of terrifying violence or stretches of dead calm equally terrifying in their implication for the water and food supply, and who arrived at last at Acre or Jaffa, thin and nauseated and unkempt and overwhelmed, and began the journey inland to the holy city. The experience of arriving at Jerusalem, seeing its walls and towers and domes from the ridge above the city. The moment of first recognition is described in pilgrim accounts with a consistency that suggests it was as close to universal as anything in medieval experience. Pilgrims collapsed. They wept without being able to say exactly why. They tore their clothes and bowed to the ground and remained that way for long moments before they could rise. Something was satisfied in them that they had not known was starved. Some deep need to stand in the place where the stories they had been told since childhood actually happened, where the sacred was not a matter of faith alone but of geography, of stone underfoot, of specific air in the lungs. The Muslim world's response to the Crusader presence was not immediate or unified. In the decades following the First Crusade, the Islamic rulers of the region were themselves too divided, too occupied with internal rivalries between the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and the Seljuk Sultanates in Syria and Iraq, and with the many smaller princes and emirs who governed their own fragments of a fragmented political landscape, to mount a coordinated counteroffensive. Individual leaders raided Crusader territories. Individual crusaders raided Muslim ones. Treaties were negotiated, broken, renegotiated. Trade continued, because merchants on both sides found commerce more profitable than perpetual war. There were periods in the first half of the 12th century when the frontier between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and its Muslim neighbors functioned almost like the frontier between any two medieval states, porous, contested, but also crossed daily by traders and travelers who had no particular investment in the theological arguments of their overlords. Let the night settle a little more around you now. The stars over the Judean hills are bright and numerous. This sky, before the age of artificial light, would have been extraordinary. The Milky Way, a solid river of light overhead. The same stars that medieval pilgrims and soldiers and merchants navigated by. The same stars the muezzin saw when he climbed the minaret before dawn to call the faithful to prayer. The air at this hour on the ridge smells of cooling stone and the faint sweetness of night-blooming flowers. And from far below in the valley you can hear, if the wind is right, the sound of a creek moving over stones. Let your breathing slow a little. The history is not going anywhere. It has been here a very long time. The figure who changed everything, who transformed the military and political situation of the Crusader states from a state of uneasy equilibrium into genuine crisis, was Saladin, known in Arabic as Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, which means the righteousness of the faith. Joseph, son of Job. He was born in 1037 in Tikrit, in what is now Iraq, the son of a Kurdish military commander in the service of the Zengid sultans of Syria. His early career was spent in the court and military of Nur ad-Din, the Zengid ruler of Damascus, and when Nur ad-Din sent him to Egypt in 1064 with a force to shore up the failing Fatimid Caliphate against a crusader threat, Saladin found himself, through a combination of skill and fortune and political acuity, in control of Egypt within 3 years. After Nur ad-Din's death, he moved to unite Egypt and Syria under his own authority, and then extended that authority to include most of the Islamic lands surrounding the Crusader states, not through personal aggression as much as through the steady logic of a man who had a vision of what unification could accomplish. The accounts that survive of Saladin from both sides of the conflict describe a man who was unusual in his era in ways that cut across the cultural and religious divide. He was devout, genuinely, deeply devout. A man who is described as weeping at the recitation of the Quran, and who organized his days around prayer with a discipline that impressed even his secular subordinates. He was also a man of considerable personal generosity, generous to the point, his biographers note, of giving away money and horses and robes of honor so freely that his treasury was often empty. He was known for keeping his word when he gave it, which was not universal among the rulers of his day on either side of the frontier, and for a quality of personal attention to the people around him, to his soldiers, to supplicants, to the scholars and poets who gathered at his court, that made him, by all accounts, genuinely beloved. The chronicles written by his opponents, by the Franks and the English and the French who fought against him and lost to him, often describe him with undisguised admiration. He was, they said, a chivalrous enemy. And in the 12th century, that was the highest compliment you could offer a man you were fighting. Saladin's court at Damascus was a place of learning as well as of military command. Physicians and poets and theologians gathered there, And Saladin himself is described as a man who loved conversation and argument and the reading aloud of history and poetry in the evenings after the day's business was done. He had grown up in a tradition that saw no contradiction between military excellence and intellectual cultivation, and he embodied that tradition fully. The scholars who wrote about him in his own lifetime were struck by the same quality that struck his enemies: a consistency between private and public self. A man who behaved the same in his tent as on his throne, who did not change his manner when the audience changed. This quality, what you might call integrity in its original sense, the quality of being undivided, of being the same thing all the way through, is rare enough in any era to be remarkable, and it is part of what made him the subject of admiration and legend long after his death. In both the Islamic world that revered him and the European tradition that tried, more awkwardly, to find a place for him in its pantheon of great men. The battle that shattered the kingdom of Jerusalem came on the 4th of July in the year 1187, at a place called the Horns of Hattin, a pair of volcanic hills on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, above a plateau of dry scrub and basalt stone. Saladin had maneuvered the crusader army into a position of extraordinary vulnerability, cutting it off from water in the summer heat of the Galilee, then setting fire to the dry grass around it before the final assault. The army of Jerusalem, the largest force the kingdom had ever fielded, reinforced by troops from its allies and carrying the true cross, the relic believed to be a fragment of the actual cross of the crucifixion, was destroyed almost in its entirety in a single afternoon. The king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, was captured. Most of the knights of the great military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, who were taken alive were executed the following day, because they were the professional soldiers of the crusade, the ones who could not be ransomed and released without simply returning to the battlefield. Within 3 months, Saladin had taken Jerusalem and most of the kingdom with it. His entry into Jerusalem, the mirror image of the Crusader conquest of 88 years before, was, by all historical accounts, conducted with deliberate restraint. The population was ransomed rather than massacred. Those who could not afford ransom were, after negotiation, allowed to leave. Saladin used his own funds to ransom thousands of the poorest. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not demolished but left standing. The Christian custodians permitted to remain. The crosses were removed from the Dome of the Rock and from Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders had converted to use as a stable and a headquarters. Both were reconsecrated to Muslim worship. Saladin's behavior in Jerusalem was not without self-interest. A show of magnanimity toward a conquered city demonstrated the qualities of a just ruler, which mattered for political legitimacy, but neither was it merely strategic. His biographers describe him as specifically and consciously choosing to behave differently from the Crusaders of 88 years before. And there is no reason to doubt that the contrast was intended as a moral statement as well as a political one. The response in Europe to the fall of Jerusalem was anguish, genuine, widespread, deep. Pope Gregory VIII died on the day he learned of Hattin, and his successor called for a new crusade immediately. Three of the most powerful rulers in Christendom took the cross. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man of 70 years who led a great army through Anatolia only to die crossing a river in Cilicia, his army dissolving in grief and confusion behind him. Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, known to history as Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, who arrived at the coast of Palestine in 1191 with a fleet of his own and an energy and tactical intelligence that made him the most formidable military adversary Saladin had yet faced. The Third Crusade, the Crusade of the Kings, produced one of the most extraordinary personal rivalries in medieval history. A rivalry between Richard and Saladin that was conducted simultaneously on the battlefield and in a peculiar kind of epistolary courtesy. Messages passing between the two commanders that were formal and respectful and occasionally almost warm. Each man recognizing in the other something that the ideology of the conflict insisted could not be there. The capacity for genuine respect across the line of faith. When Richard fell ill during the siege of Jaffa, Saladin sent him fresh fruit and ice from the mountains, ice in the heat of a Palestinian summer, carried down from the snow of the Lebanon range on fast horses to be placed at the tent of an enemy commander. The gesture is recorded by chroniclers on both sides, and neither found it inexplicable, because within the cultural code of medieval chivalry, the courtesy of enemies was its own category, distinct from politics and war, a space in which the human being could be acknowledged without the conflict being compromised. The Third Crusade ended without the reconquest of Jerusalem. Richard took the coast, Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon, and came close enough to Jerusalem to see its towers on the ridge from the hills to the west, but twice turned back when his council advised that taking the city was militarily possible but holding it was not. He negotiated instead a treaty with Saladin that allowed Christian pilgrims access to the holy sites, and then sailed for home, arriving in Europe to find that his brother John had been conspiring to take the throne in his absence. Saladin died the following year. In 1193, in Damascus, having given away so much in charity that his treasury was insufficient to pay for his funeral. He was 55 years old. His empire, as such things often do, fragmented quickly among his sons and nephews. The unity he had spent his life building dissolving into the familiar pattern of competing principalities. The crusader states that remained, a thinner, more coastal thing than the kingdom of the previous century, survived for another century on the shifting politics of a Muslim world that was never again as unified against them as it had been under Saladin. The later Crusades are a different kind of story, more complicated, often more dispiriting, less illuminated by the occasional flashes of individual greatness that make the earlier period feel almost legendary by comparison. The Fourth Crusade, called in 1202, never reached the Holy Land at all. It was diverted by financial obligations, by political manipulation on the part of the Venetians who provided the fleet, by a succession of contingent decisions that seemed logical at each moment but accumulated into something its participants probably did not intend, to Constantinople, the great Christian city of the East, where the Crusaders sacked and looted and destroyed in ways that the Byzantine Greeks never forgave and that shattered the remaining trust between Eastern and Western Christianity for generations. The Fourth Crusade is in many ways the most instructive of all the Crusades, the one that reveals most clearly how a movement begun in the name of the sacred can drift through a long sequence of ordinary human motivations: greed, debt, political calculation, the logic of the immediate, to a destination that would have horrified its original architects. The later Crusades are a different kind of story, more complicated, often more dispiriting, less illuminated by the occasional flashes of individual greatness that make the earlier period feel almost legendary by comparison. The Fourth Crusade, called in 1202, never reached the Holy Land at all. It was diverted by financial obligations, by political manipulation on the part of the Venetians who provided the fleet, by a succession of contingent decisions that seemed logical at each moment but accumulated into something its participants probably did not intend, to Constantinople, the great Christian city of the East, where the Crusaders sacked and looted and destroyed in ways that the Byzantine Greeks never forgave and that shattered the remaining trust between Eastern and Western Christianity for generations. The Fourth Crusade is in many ways the most instructive of all the Crusades, the one that reveals most clearly how a movement begun in the name of the sacred can drift through a long sequence of ordinary human motivations: greed, debt, political calculation, the logic of the immediate, to a destination that would have horrified its original architects. In the summer of 1212, in a moment that is difficult even now to hold steadily in the mind, something extraordinary and heartbreaking happened in France and Germany. Large groups of children and young people, some accounts say tens of thousands, though the numbers are impossible to verify, gathered under the leadership of young shepherds and preachers who told them that God had chosen the innocent, the pure, the humble, to accomplish what the mighty had failed to accomplish. They would walk to the sea, and the sea would open for them as it had opened for Moses, and they would cross to the Holy Land and convert the Muslims by the persuasion of their faith rather than by force of arms. The movement is called the Children's Crusade. Though the participants ranged widely in age, and the word children in this context probably meant the young, the unmarried, those without established households. Many of the French contingent reached the Mediterranean coast at Marseille and found, of course, that the sea did not open. Several merchants offered them passage, and those who accepted, perhaps 7,000, were sailed not to Palestine but to North Africa, where they were sold into slavery. Many of the German contingent turned back in the Alps, defeated by the cold and the mountains, and struggled home as best they could. Some died on the road. A few may have actually reached the Mediterranean and found passage and arrived in the East. The records are fragmentary. The story of the Children's Crusade is a story about the uses of innocence in the service of ideology, and about the catastrophic gap between sacred promise and earthly reality. And it is almost impossible to read without a kind of grief for the individuals inside it, the young people who believed they had been chosen, who walked for weeks toward a sea that would not open, who found instead the ordinary cruelty of the world waiting where the miracle was supposed to be. There is a kind of exhaustion that settles over the later Crusades when you read about them, not the exhaustion of the soldiers, though that was real, but a structural exhaustion, the exhaustion of an idea that has been running on borrowed energy for a long time. The Fifth, the Sixth, the Seventh Crusades, each launched with ceremony and vows and the sincere conviction that this time, with the right leader and the right strategy, the effort would succeed. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor of the 13th century, a man of extraordinary intellectual gifts who spoke 6 languages and corresponded with Muslim scholars and kept a menagerie of exotic animals and was rumored by his enemies to be an atheist, achieved by negotiation what the armies of the preceding Crusades had failed to achieve by force, securing access to Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Nazareth for Christian pilgrims through a treaty with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil in 1229. The city changed hands between Christian and Muslim control several more times in the following decades. The tides of military fortune pushing it back and forth with a regularity that suggested, to anyone watching from a distance, that the question of who held it was less settled than either side wished to believe. The end came for the Crusader states not suddenly but slowly, the way the end of things often comes, city by city, fortress by fortress, over the decades following the rise of the Mamluk sultans of Egypt, who were a different kind of military force from anything the Crusaders had faced before. The Mamluks, a ruling caste of former military slaves, originally from the Turkic and Caucasian steppes, who had seized power in Egypt and proved themselves the most effective military force in the medieval Middle East, took Caesarea in 1265, Arsuf in 1265, Jaffa and Antioch in 1268, the great Hospitallers' fortress of the Croix de Chevaliers in 1271. Louis IX of France, the king known to posterity as Saint Louis, a man of deep personal piety who inspired genuine devotion in his followers even as his military judgment sometimes failed him, died of dysentery outside Tunis in 1270. While organizing what would have been an Eighth Crusade, his last words said to have been a single word:
Jérusalem.
The city he died trying to reach was already beyond the horizon of the possible. The final act came in 1291. At the city of Acre, the great port on the Carmel coast that had been the capital of the Rump Crusader kingdom for a century, a prosperous and cosmopolitan city of merchants and pilgrims and soldiers and scholars, its streets loud with a dozen languages, its harbor full of ships from every Mediterranean port. The Mamluk Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil besieged it with an army of enormous size and the most advanced siege technology the medieval world possessed. And after 7 weeks the walls gave way and the city fell, and with it the last significant Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The remaining coastal towns, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, surrendered or were evacuated in the weeks that followed. The era of the Crusader states was over. The last Franks sailed away from the Palestinian coast and watched the towers of Acre growing smaller in the distance, and the sea between them and the shore grew wide, and the shore dissolved into the haze of the eastern horizon, and they were gone. What was left behind, in the landscape and in the memory of the peoples who remained there, was complex and lasting. The castles are still there. As I said, the great limestone fortresses on their ridges, empty now of the armies that built them but speaking, in their scale and their permanence, of the seriousness of purpose that drove their construction. The religious communities that were established in the Crusader period, the Armenian and Coptic and Ethiopian and Greek Orthodox and Syriac Christian communities of Jerusalem, whose ancestors were already old when the Crusaders arrived and who survived the Crusades and the Mamluk period and the Ottoman period and into the present, still maintain their ancient churches and their ancient liturgies in the narrow lanes of the old city. Bells and incense and chant filling the air of a city that has been prayed in without interruption for longer than most of the world's civilizations have existed. The presence of the Crusades in the Islamic world's memory of its history, a presence that remained vivid and felt for centuries longer than it remained vivid in Europe, shaped in ways both obvious and subtle the way that world understood its relationship to the West. A relationship that continued to be negotiated in the language of that encounter long after the language itself had been forgotten in the places where the Crusaders came from. And there is the Jewish presence, woven through all of this in the way that Jewish history in this land is always woven through the histories of those who came after and claimed it. The communities that existed in Palestine through the Crusader period, sometimes protected by the Fatimids or the Ayyubids or the Mamluks, sometimes expelled or persecuted, maintaining through everything their connection to a land they had never entirely left, praying toward Jerusalem in synagogues from Toledo to Baghdad, carrying with them a longing so old and so stubborn it had become indistinguishable from identity itself. The transmission of knowledge that happened across the lines of the Crusader conflict, quietly, without fanfare, through the slow osmosis of people living near each other and being curious about each other, was one of the era's less celebrated but most consequential developments. European crusaders and settlers encountered in the Levant a medical tradition, rooted in the Greek classical knowledge that had been translated and developed by Islamic scholars over centuries, that was in many respects more sophisticated than what they had left behind. They encountered mathematics and astronomy and philosophy. They encountered sugarcane, unknown in Europe before the Crusades, and brought back knowledge of its cultivation. They encountered windmills of a different design from the European kind. They encountered new fabrics, new dyes, new architectural techniques, new foods. The word assassin entered European languages from the Arabic Hashishin during this period, as did words like admiral and alcove and arsenal and many others, each one a small fossil of contact, of exchange, of two cultures pressing against each other and leaving their marks in each other's language the way two wet surfaces leave their impressions when pressed together and pulled apart. Let the weight of all of this settle gently now, without pressing on it. It is a heavy history in some ways, full of loss and violence and the wreckage of good intentions and the damage of bad ones. But there is also, in its full complexity, something that is simply human and recognizable, the way people believe, the way belief moves them, the way they build and destroy and build again, the way extraordinary individuals emerge out of ordinary violence to do something that surprises history, the way two enemies can recognize each other across the line of a war and find, in that recognition, something that neither doctrine nor politics quite knows what to do with. Saladin sending ice to a fevered Richard. Richard writing back his respects. The thing that passes between them is not peace. Exactly, but it is not nothing either. The night has come fully now to the ridge above the Judean hills. The last color has left the western sky, and the darkness has deepened into the particular blue-black of a clear Mediterranean night. And the stars are out in force, the same stars that medieval pilgrims, arriving at last at the ridge above Jerusalem after months of walking, stopped to look at in exhausted, incredulous wonder, thinking, I am here. I have arrived. Whatever this cost, I have arrived. The city below the ridge is quieter now. The lights of windows here and there, the occasional sound of a late muezzin or a distant bell, the very faint smell of bread being baked somewhere in the dark warrens of the old city, where the ovens that were lit before dawn are only now beginning to cool. Let your thoughts drift, if they will, like those pilgrims arriving in the night, footsore and grateful and overwhelmed, wanting only to stop moving, to set down the weight they have been carrying, to rest. The history does not demand anything from you. It only asks to be carried gently, the way all of history asks to be carried, with attention, with the knowledge that behind every political and military abstraction there were people, individual and irreducible and mortal, who lived inside it and felt it from the inside and could not see the shape of it the way we can from this distance. They were only living their lives in the light available to them, as we are only living ours. Let your breathing slow now. The stone of the ridge is holding the last of the day's warmth, radiating it gently into the cooling air. And if you were to press your palm against it, you would feel that warmth, surprising and intimate, the stored heat of hours of sunlight returning to the night. The olive trees on the slope below stand very still. Their leaves, silver in daylight, are dark now, dark and motionless, barely distinguishable from the sky except by a quality of density, a slightly greater darkness where the leaves are. They are old, these olives, Some of the trees in the groves of Jerusalem are old enough, it is said, to have been alive during the time of the Crusades. Certainly old enough to have been rooted in this earth for a very long time, older than the political arrangements of any particular century, older than the names that have been given to this land by the many peoples who have held it and lost it and mourned it. The mind is growing quiet now. The events of centuries ago are settling back into the long quiet of the past, becoming the past completely, not a lesson or an argument or a wound, just something that happened on these hills, under this sky, to people who were alive and are not, who believed as deeply as it is possible to believe and acted on that belief as best they could, and whose bones are long since part of this earth. The earth keeps everything. It takes everything back into itself eventually. The stone and the bone and the memory. And it holds it all with the same patience it holds the olive roots and the rainwater and the seeds that are waiting in the dry ground for the first rains of autumn. The stars are very bright over the city. They are always brightest in the last hours of the night, in the pause between the setting of the moon and the first lightning of the dawn, that darkest, stillest hour when the city has been asleep for a long time and the only sounds are the sounds the land makes by itself, without human assistance. A dog somewhere far below. The very faint breath of a wind moving up from the valley. The sound of the city's own great age, which is something like silence but is not quite silence. A frequency just below what the waking mind can register but one the sleeping mind hears perfectly. Let sleep come now. The way the night came, not all at once, but in layers, each one softer and deeper and more complete than the one before. The ridge holds the city. The hills hold the ridge. The old land holds the hills. And somewhere in the long, quiet continuity of all that has happened here, and all that will happen, and all that simply is the olive trees rooted in their ancient earth, the stars completing their slow arcs, the stones glowing faintly with their stored warmth as the night deepens around them. Somewhere in all of that, there is something large enough to hold everything, patient enough to wait for everything, old enough to have no particular opinion about the difference between what has been lost and what remains. Sleep well. The old city keeps its watch.